Her great-aunt sold her with a cracked mirror to a wagoner heading west. The mirror was the part that stuck with me. Cracked straight across the middle, still in its frame, one of those oval things with the painted roses on the wood that somebody's grandmother had carried from somewhere east of the Alleghenies. The old woman, the aunt, she set it on the seat of my wagon like it was coin, like it settled the account. Then she went back inside and closed the door of that house, and I never saw her move a curtain to look out. The girl was already up on the box beside me. She had her own small bag between her feet, and she was looking straight west down the road the way people look when they don't want to look at the thing they just left. I didn't say anything. I clucked to the mules and we rolled. Her name was Nora Vasquez Creel. That's what she told me when I asked, about a mile out. She said all three names like she expected me to argue with one of them. I said mine, Calhoun Bray, and then we were quiet again for a good long stretch, which suited me. I want to be plain about what had happened, because it matters to how the rest of it went. I was a contract hauler out of Dodge, working the trail north into the Colorado high country, taking freight for a syndicate that was putting up a sawmill operation near a town called Arroyo Seco. I'd been hired to move 3 wagons, mine, and 2 others with drivers. But one of the drivers had broken his leg the week before, and the second had lit out for California without much explanation. And so I was moving one load myself with the help of a half-deaf old man named Prosper who could handle mules, but not much else. The syndicate had prepaid for the delivery, and the penalty clause if I didn't make it was steep enough to take my rig. The great-aunt, a woman named Eutha Sill, had some arrangement with the syndicate man in Dodge. I never learned the whole shape of it. What I understood was that Nora was supposed to cook and keep camp for the duration of the haul in exchange for passage to Arroyo Seco, where there was supposed to be work for her at a boarding house run by a cousin. And the mirror was Eutha Sill's contribution to the girl's provisions, which tells you about all you need to know about Eutha Sill. What I understood less clearly, and understood better as the days went on, was that the syndicate man had told the aunt something more than that. That Nora would be, I'll say it plainly, available to whoever was running the outfit. That the arrangement included more than cooking. I didn't know that the first day. The second day, I started to understand it from the way she flinched when I came around the side of the wagon to check the lashing. Just a small thing, the way she went still and watched my hands, like she was calculating something about me fast, the way an animal calculates a gap in a fence. I didn't say anything about it then either. I just moved past her and checked the lashing and told Prosper to pull the rear wheel chock, and we got moving again. That night I cooked. She watched me from across the fire with that same measuring look. I handed her a plate and she took it and ate and didn't thank me, and I didn't wait for it. After she said, "What am I supposed to do?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Eutha told me what you'd expect." I was quiet for a bit. The fire was burning down and the mules were settled, and the country out there past the firelight was big and dark and cold, even in August, that far west. I said, "Eutha Sill lied to you about what I expect. You cook if you feel like it. Otherwise you ride and we get you to Arroyo Seco." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Why?" I said, "Because that's what a man does." I didn't say it like a speech. I wasn't making a speech. It was just the only thing I knew how to say that was true. She cooked. Every morning before first light, she had the coffee on and biscuits in the Dutch oven, and by the time I had the mules watered and harnessed, she had a plate ready. She didn't offer it. She just left it on the tailgate where I could reach it. I ate standing up, watching the sky go gray in the east, and it was good food. Better than I'd made myself in a long time. She knew plants, that surprised me. Second week out, she came back from a draw with a handful of something dark green and started tearing it into the stew. I asked what it was. She said her grandmother had taught her, her mother's mother, a Comanche woman named Teresita who had lived near the Caprock country in Texas until the army cleared the band north. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you say something that happened a long time ago and is just part of the geography of your life. I asked what her grandmother was like. She said small and very fast with her hands, and she never wasted anything. She said it, and then she looked away to the west the same way she'd looked when we rolled away from Eutha Sill's house. I didn't press. The trail we were running went through 3 stages of country. First the flat, brown, wind-burned stretch of the high plains, where you could see a rider 5 miles off, and there was nothing between you and the horizon but grass and the occasional line of cottonwood down in a draw. Then it folded up into the foothill country, red and rocky, where the wagons had to be worked carefully on the downslopes, and the mules fought you at every switchback. Then finally up into the pines, where it smelled like cold water and the trail got narrow and the shadows came early. We were still in the flat country about 9 days out when the Garner brothers found us. There were 3 of them. They rode into camp just before dark, which is the rudest thing a man can do on the trail unless he means something by it, and they meant something. They said they were headed for the same country we were. They said they'd heard there was a woman with the outfit. They said all of this to me while looking past me at Nora, who was at the fire with her back turned, though I knew she could hear every word. The oldest one, he had a broken nose that had set badly and a way of smiling that didn't involve his eyes. He said, "Syndicate man told us you were carrying freight for the mill. Said the cook was available for company." I said the syndicate man was wrong. He said we paid for it. I said, then you paid for something that wasn't for sale, and you'll want to take that up with him when you get to Arroyo Seco. He looked at me then, not past me. He recalculated something, same as Nora had, only he was calculating whether I was bluffing. I want to be honest. I was not a young man even then, and I was not particularly big, and I had 3 days of trail dust on me, and I was tired in the way you get tired after 9 days of working mules. But I held still and let him look. He said, "We'll camp nearby." I said, "Camp wherever you like, but come into my camp uninvited after dark, and I will not be hospitable." They rode off maybe 200 yards and made their fire. Prosper, who was half-deaf but not blind, had drifted sideways during the whole conversation until he was standing near the wagon tongue, and he had his shotgun leaning against it within arm's reach, and he'd been watching the brothers' horses the whole time. I looked at him after they rode off, and he spat in the dirt and went back to tending the mules. He never once said anything about it to me, before or after, which is what I mean when I say he couldn't handle much beyond mules. Nora said nothing either, but that night she moved her bedroll from the tent she'd been sleeping in, which was behind the second wagon, and she put it under the wagon box between the wheels, which is the most sheltered and defensible position in a camp, under the box where I slept. I didn't say anything about it. She hadn't asked, and she didn't need to ask. She just made a decision. The Garner brothers stayed with us 3 more days, keeping their distance. They didn't come into camp, but they were there, a presence at the edge of the firelight, a set of silhouettes, a reminder. On the 3rd night, the oldest one came to the edge of camp and said he wanted to talk price. I was sitting on a wheel hub smoking, and I didn't get up. I said, "Go back to your fire." He said some things then, about her, about what he'd paid, about what he thought I was doing with her myself, and it was ugly and meant to be. I let him finish. Then I said, "You ride out of this camp now and don't come back, or I will shoot your horses and you will walk to Arroyo Seco with nothing. I'm not going to shoot you. I'm going to shoot your horses. And then when you finally get there on foot, you can tell whoever will listen that Calhoun Bray took your horses because you couldn't keep your mouth shut, and I want you to think about how that story sounds when you tell it." I don't know if it was the specificity of it, or that I'd used my name, which meant I wasn't afraid of being remembered. But he stood there for a moment, and then he went back to his fire. Before first light, they were gone. Nora was awake. She'd heard all of it. I knew she was awake because I could hear from her breathing that she wasn't asleep. But she didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything, and after a while I heard her breathing settle. The foothill country was where the wagon work got hard. We lost 2 days to a washout on a creek crossing that took out most of the road, and I had to run the wagons around through a rocky stretch that wasn't meant for wagons, and I cracked the left front wheel of the freight wagon bad enough that it needed to be rebuilt before we could push it hard again. I spent a day and a half on that wheel. Nora brought me coffee and food without being asked and sat close enough that I knew she was there, though she didn't crowd me or talk at me while I worked. She handed me tools when I reached for them, and she figured out what I was reaching for before I said the name of it, which is a thing that takes attention. There was one evening in the foothill country I think about sometimes. We were camped in a fold of red rock out of the wind, and the fire was good and high, and the mules were quiet. Prosper had fallen asleep sitting up against a wheel, which was his habit. Nora and I were on opposite sides of the fire, and she was repairing something in her bag, a seam, I think, on a piece of clothing. And I was looking at the map I'd been working from, though by that point I knew the route well enough that I didn't need the map. I just had it open. She said, "What was the hardest haul you ever ran?" I said, winter haul to a mining camp in the San Juans. 3 wagons of timber, 6 mules each. Lost 2 mules to a slide and had to redistribute the loads, and 2 of my drivers quit on me when we were 3 days from the camp. Finished it with 1 man and myself. She said, "Did you get paid?" I said, "I got paid." She almost smiled, not quite, but close. She said, "Did you have people then? A family?" I said I had been married once, that my wife had died of fever about 6 years prior, that we'd had a son who was grown now and working cattle down in the Panhandle country and who wrote to me twice a year. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Eutha Sill is my father's sister. She is not a blood relation on my mother's side. I want you to know that. She is not family in any way that matters." I said, "All right." She said, "I have not had family in the way other people mean it, since my grandmother." I said, "I know something about that." She looked at me across the fire, not the calculating look she'd had at the beginning, something different. "Just looking." She said, "I think you do." And then she went back to her sewing, and I went back to not reading the map, and after a while the fire burned down and we slept. The pine country came up on us fast. One morning we were in the rock and the scrub, and by afternoon the trees had closed in overhead and the air had changed, and the mules were blowing steam in the shade. Arroyo Seco was 4 days ahead. I had been thinking about the boarding house cousin. I'd been thinking about it since the foothill country, if I'm honest. I didn't know what waited for her there. She didn't know either. She'd been told there was work, which was what Eutha Sill had told her, and Eutha Sill had already demonstrated how much her word was worth. I didn't say anything about it. It wasn't my concern in any official sense. She wasn't my responsibility past delivery. That was the arrangement. But I knew some things about Arroyo Seco. The syndicate was the main employer in that town. The boarding house they'd mentioned was a place I'd heard of, and what I'd heard wasn't encouraging. It was the kind of boarding house that had a back entrance that men used and a front entrance that kept the pretense of something else, and the women who worked there didn't do laundry. The second to last night before we reached town, I told her what I'd heard. I didn't soften it. I said what I knew and let her sit with it. She listened without interrupting, which was her way, and when I finished, she was quiet for a while. She said, "And you're telling me this because?" I said, "Because you're not going there not knowing." She said, "What would you have me do instead?" I said, "I'm putting in a second contract with the syndicate to haul timber back out of this country starting in 3 weeks. I need a camp cook and a decent hand with mules for a 4-month run. I pay fair wages. You'd have your own tent, and the work is real, and I can write you a letter of account when it's done that you can take to any reputable outfit on the plains." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "Why would you do that?" I said, "I need a good camp cook." She said, "Calhoun." I said, "Yeah." She said, "That's not why." And I didn't say anything because she was right, and she knew she was right, and I didn't have a cleaner way to say the real reason except that she'd been sold with a cracked mirror and handed to a stranger, and she'd held her spine straight the whole way west, and she'd handed me tools before I asked for them, and she'd sat close enough to be present and far enough not to crowd me, and I had not met many people in my life who knew how to do that. And I was not ready to roll into Arroyo Seco and hand her over to whatever waited at that boarding house. After a while she said, "I'll want fair wages." I said, "Fair wages." She said, "I'll want my own tent, and I'll want the letter of account at the end." I said that too. She said, "Then yes." And that was that. We rolled into Arroyo Seco on a Thursday late afternoon, the light coming flat and gold through the pines, and the town sitting in a little bowl of a valley with smoke coming up from the mill already, which meant the first crews were at work. I delivered the freight to the syndicate yard and settled the contract and got my money, which was the relief it always was when the penalty clause was off the table. The syndicate man was a small, precise fellow named Aldous Creek who wore his hair parted very carefully and kept a ledger open on his desk at all times. He counted out my fee, and I signed the receipt, and then I said I wanted to talk to him about the arrangement he'd made with the woman traveling with my outfit. He looked up from the ledger. He said, "What arrangement?" I said, "The one you made with a woman named Eutha Sill in Dodge." His expression went careful and still. He said something about a misunderstanding. He said something about the boarding house and a cook position. His eyes moved past me to the window, and I knew he was checking whether Nora was outside. I said, let's be clear about what the arrangement was and what it isn't going to be. And I said it the same way I'd said things to the Garner brothers, not loud, not heated, just precise and unhurried, so he understood that I had thought it through and was not going to move. He looked at me for a moment, and then he made a note in his ledger, and he said the boarding house arrangement would not be pursued. I said, I'm putting in for the timber contract. He said the terms, and I said my terms, and we went back and forth for about 20 minutes, and when I walked out, I had a signed contract for the run and a rate per load that was 10% higher than what I'd have taken if I hadn't been in a good position to walk away. Nora was waiting by the wagon. She could read my face well enough by then. She said, well. I said, 4 months starting in 3 weeks. We'll need to reprovision, and I'll need to hire 2 more drivers. She said, I can ask Prosper if he wants to stay on. I said Prosper would follow those mules off a cliff. He's staying on. She almost laughed. She had a way of doing that, of almost laughing, pulling it back just a little, like she was still deciding whether laughing was safe. I'd noticed it back in the foothill country, and I'd let it alone. We found rooms at a real boarding house, one that was what it said it was, run by a German woman named Maith Becker who charged fair and kept a clean kitchen and didn't ask questions. I paid for Nora's room, and she started to object, and I said, it comes out of the advance, which it didn't, but she let it go. Those 3 weeks before the contract started were strange. I was busy, provisioning, hiring, checking the wagons, dealing with the syndicate yard. But there were hours that weren't spoken for, and I didn't know what to do with hours that weren't spoken for. I'd been on the road or working toward a road for so long that having a fixed address, even for 3 weeks, felt like wearing a boot on the wrong foot. Nora started helping Maith Becker in the kitchen, not because she was asked. She just started appearing down there in the mornings, and by the end of the first week she knew where everything was, and she and Maith had some kind of running conversation in mixed English and German, and possibly Comanche that I couldn't always follow. I'd come down for breakfast and Nora would be there, and we'd eat at the same table, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and it was, I don't know the right word for it, settled maybe, like something that had been slightly wrong-angled for a long time had found its proper sit. One morning, second week, I think, because I remember the first frost was on the window panes, she put a cup of coffee in front of me, and then instead of going back to the stove, she stood beside me for a moment, her hand resting on the table near my shoulder. Not touching, just near. And she said, I want you to know that I see what you did. I said, what's that? She said, between the Garner brothers and Aldous Creek and all of it. You didn't have to do any of it. It wasn't in the arrangement. I said, no. She said, it was the kind of thing a good man does. I said, I told you, that's what a man does. She said, most men aren't that kind of man, Calhoun. And she put her hand on my shoulder then. Not a long time, just a moment, the weight of it. A plain thing, her hand on my shoulder, and her standing there beside me looking out the frosted window at the street. I put my hand over hers. We stayed like that for a little. Then Maith Becker came in from the back and started making noise with pots, and we moved apart, and Nora went back to the stove, and I drank my coffee and looked out at the frost on the glass. I can still feel the weight of her hand. The 4-month run was hard in the way all work in that country was hard. Long days, cold starts, equipment that needed constant attention, men who were good sometimes and difficult other times. We ran 12 loads of cut timber out of the high country before the snow closed the passes, which was more than the syndicate had contracted for, and I renegotiated the last 3 loads at a rate that made Aldous Creek's careful expression go even more careful. Nora ran the camp the way she'd run everything, without waste, without fuss, with a precision that came from paying attention. She knew all the drivers' names by the second week. She knew which ones needed a full plate and which ones ate light and which one, a young fellow from Missouri named Cord, needed somebody to check on him when he went quiet, because when he went quiet it meant something was wrong with the rig and he was afraid to say so. She figured that out herself. I didn't tell her. She got her wages every week without fail. I kept a written account, she kept her own. The letter of account I wrote her at the end of the run was a full page. It said what she'd done and what she was worth, and I signed my name to it, and I said she could show it to any outfit on the plains, and they'd hire her that day. She read it at the table in Maith Becker's kitchen. She read it twice. She said, "This is more than we agreed on." I said, "It's accurate." She folded it and put it in her bag, the same small bag she'd had between her feet when we rolled away from Sil's house. She sat for a moment. Then she said, "Are you putting in for another contract?" I said, "There's a spring run. I haven't decided." She said, "I think you've decided." I said, "Maybe." She said, "I want to go on it." I said, "You have a letter of account now. You could go anywhere." She said, "I know that." There was a silence. Outside, the snow was coming down in the pine trees, and the kitchen smelled like Maeve Becker's bread and wood smoke. Nora had her hands folded on the table in front of her. Her hands were capable hands, work-scarred now, strong at the knuckle. She said, "I'm not asking to go on it because I have nowhere else to go. I'm asking because I choose to." I looked at her. She said, "Do you understand the difference?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then do you want me on the spring run?" I said, "Yes." She looked at me the way she'd looked across that foothill campfire, not calculating, just clear. She reached across the table and took my hand. Both her hands around mine, the way you hold something you mean to keep. I could feel the callus on her palm and the pressure of each finger. She said, "Good. I should say something about the mirror, because I think about it still. When we'd rolled out of Sil's yard that first morning, I'd set it on the seat between us, that cracked oval thing in its painted frame. About 10 miles out, it slid off the seat on a rut and would have fallen to the floorboard, but Nora caught it, quick as anything, and held it in her lap. She looked at it for a while, at her own face in the cracked glass split down the middle. Then she wrapped it in her shawl and tucked it in her bag. I said, "You don't have to keep that." She said, "I know." She kept it anyway. That winter in Arroyo Seco, I saw it once on the sill of her room at Maeve Becker's. She'd stood it upright so it faced the window, and it caught the morning light and threw it in pieces across the ceiling. Not clean. Nothing clean, just fractured light moving on the plaster as the sun came up. She saw me looking at it, and she said, "It's not a bad mirror. It just shows you yourself a little sideways." I thought about that for a while. I thought that might be how I'd been seen for a long time. A little sideways. Partway. A man hauling freight through hard country, doing the work, keeping his word, not much else visible. You get used to that. You stop expecting anybody to see straight. She looked straight. The spring run, we married in a canyon camp in April, with Prosper and Cord and 4 others as witnesses, and a circuit preacher who was heading north anyway and agreed to stop. The ceremony took about 10 minutes. Afterwards, Maeve Becker's bread was produced from somewhere. Nora had packed it, and Prosper took off his hat and held it to his chest, and said something in the direction of the sky that nobody caught because he was half-deaf and didn't modulate well when he was moved. I have a photograph from a few years later, taken by a man in a town I've since forgotten the name of. We're standing in front of the wagon. I have my hand at her back. She is looking at the camera with that almost smile. I am looking at her. We ran loads for another 11 years out of that high country. She outlasted 2 sets of mules and 3 wagons, and one winter that nearly killed us both in a pass we should not have tried and didn't try again. She kept the accounts in a ledger she bought in Arroyo Seco, a good leather ledger, not the cheap kind, and her numbers were always right. When we finally stopped, it was her idea. She said, "We have enough." She said it the way she said most things, plain and already decided. And I looked at what we had, which was more than I'd ever thought I'd have in every sense of the word, and I said, "Yeah, all right." I still have the ledger, her handwriting in it. Precise and a little slanted, the way she'd learned it from somebody I never asked to. And the mirror, I still have that too. I don't know why she kept it, and I couldn't tell you now why I've kept it since. It sits on a shelf, and it shows me myself, a little sideways, same as always. But that's all right. A man can live with a sideways view of himself when he knows somebody saw him clear.